A single F-15A Eagle rolled off the McDonnell Douglas production line in 1974, carrying a unit cost of $14.1 million. Down the hall from the Pentagon offices, where that price tag got approved, a small group of defense analysts was circulating a proposal for a fighter that could do most of the same air-to-air mission for $2.8 million per copy. The Air Force wanted nothing to do with it. The logic against a cheap, lightweight fighter was straightforward, and it came from the top. The service had spent a decade fighting for the F-15, its first dedicated air superiority fighter since the F-86 Sabre. Generals, who'd bled through the bureaucratic wars to get that program funded, weren't about to let some cut-rate alternative undermine it. If Congress saw you could build 5 fighters for the price of 1 Eagle, the obvious question became, why are we buying Eagles? The lightweight fighter concept didn't just threaten a procurement line, it threatened an institutional identity. The Air Force saw itself as a force built around the best aircraft money could buy, and affordable was a word that made 4-star generals physically uncomfortable. The men pushing the concept didn't care. Colonel John Boyd, a former fighter pilot turned tactical theorist, and Pierre Sprey, a civilian analyst at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, had been building the intellectual case since the late 1960s. Their argument was rooted in something the Air Force preferred not to discuss: the disappointing kill ratios over Vietnam, where American fighters designed to launch missiles at long range kept ending up in close-in dogfights they weren't optimized for. Boyd's energy-maneuverability theory reduced air combat to mathematics: thrust-to-weight ratio, wing loading, specific excess power. By his calculations, what the Air Force actually needed was a small, agile, relatively simple aircraft built in large numbers. Boyd told anyone who'd listen. In a 1997 biography by Robert Coram, colleagues recalled Boyd's blunt assessment of Pentagon procurement. People say they want to win, but they don't want to pay the price. They'd rather have a gold-plated hangar queen. The Air Force's official position was that it didn't need a lightweight fighter. The F-15 could handle everything. A cheaper alternative would dilute funding and signal that the Eagle wasn't worth its sticker price. So, the Pentagon did what it always does when confronted with an idea it can't kill outright but refuses to embrace. It authorized a technology demonstration. 2 prototypes, limited scope, no commitment to production. The program was designed to fail quietly. The lightweight fighter program was never really about an airplane. It was about proving the Pentagon's acquisition system had lost the ability to build weapons that worked. Boyd had been refining this argument since his days as an instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in the 1950s, where he earned the nickname 42nd Boyd for his standing bet that he could defeat any pilot in simulated air combat within 40 seconds. He never collected on the losing end. What made Boyd dangerous to the establishment wasn't his stick and rudder skill, it was his obsession with understanding why he won. The energy maneuverability theory he developed with mathematician Thomas Christie quantified fighter performance in ways the Air Force had never formalized. Every aircraft could be mapped across its entire flight envelope: how much energy it could gain or lose at any speed, altitude, and G-loading. When Boyd ran those numbers on American fighters over Vietnam, the results were ugly. The F-4 Phantom, a 58,000-pound interceptor pressed into the dogfighting role, was getting outmaneuvered by MiG-21s that weighed half as much. Pierre Sprey brought a different weapon to the fight: economics. An analyst with degrees from Yale and Cornell, who'd done statistical work for Grumman before joining the Pentagon, Sprey argued that combat effectiveness wasn't about individual aircraft performance. It was about sortie generation rates, fleet size, reliability, and maintenance hours per flight hour. A force of 1,000 adequate fighters would dominate a force of 200 superb ones, because numbers created options that no single platform could match. He and Boyd made an unlikely pair. Boyd was loud and profane, known for jabbing his finger into the chests of generals while making a point. Sprey operated differently: cerebral, precise, the kind of analyst who could bury you in data before you realized you'd lost the argument. Together with Christie, who had the mathematical rigor to back up Boyd's theories with hard modeling, they formed what Pentagon insiders began calling the Fighter Mafia. The name was half-mocking. What they were doing to acquisition policy was not. Their specification for a lightweight fighter read like heresy to an Air Force building, the F-15. A gross weight under 20,000 pounds, a thrust-to-weight ratio above 1.0, a wing optimized for transonic maneuvering between Mach 0.6 and 1.6, and, most controversially, no radar. Boyd and Sprey wanted a pure knife fighter. The Air Force had authorized 2 prototypes expecting a dead end. 5 companies submitted proposals. General Dynamics and Northrop got the contracts in April 1972. 14 months. That's how long it took General Dynamics to go from contract award to a flying prototype, a timeline that would be considered fantasy in modern defense acquisition. The YF-16 rolled out of the Fort Worth plant on December 13, 1973, a sleek, 27-foot-long aircraft that looked nothing like what Boyd and Sprey had originally envisioned. It had a radar. It had a bigger engine than specified. General Dynamics designer Harry Hilliker had taken the Fighter Mafia's principles and made them practical, adding the systems a real combat aircraft would need while keeping the weight and agility numbers close to what Boyd's theory demanded. The finished product weighed in at 20,300 pounds empty, slightly over the original spec, but still less than half the F-15's empty weight. Northrop's competing YF-17 Cobra took a different approach entirely. Where General Dynamics bet everything on a single Pratt and Whitney F-100 engine, the same power plant used in the F-15, Northrop hedged with 2 smaller General Electric YJ-101 turbofans. Twin engines meant better survivability if one took damage, but they also meant more weight, more plumbing, more complexity, more drag. The YF-17 came in heavier and couldn't match the YF-16's thrust-to-weight ratio. On paper, Northrop's entry was the more conservative design, a liability in a competition born from a movement that despised conservative design. The YF-16 announced itself before anyone was ready. On January 20, 1974, during a high-speed taxi test at Edwards Air Force Base, test pilot Phil Ustrecher felt the aircraft begin rolling uncontrollably. The left horizontal stabilizer scraped the ground. The right wingtip missile actually struck the runway surface. Ustrecher had a choice between trying to regain control on the ground, where the aircraft was heading toward the dirt at 130 knots, or pulling back on the side stick controller and getting airborne. He chose the air. The YF-16's first flight lasted 6 minutes, was completely unplanned, and was captured on film by chase plane cameras that were only supposed to be documenting a taxi run. Ustrecher brought it back without damage. In a 2009 interview with Code One magazine, he recalled the decision as instinctive. The airplane was trying to fly. I let it. The official first flight came on February 2, 1974. The formal fly-off evaluation against the YF-17 ran through 1974 and into early 1975, with both aircraft put through hundreds of test sorties at Edwards. Air Force evaluators measured acceleration, sustained turn rate, specific excess power across the envelope. Exactly the metrics Boyd had spent 15 years arguing should determine fighter selection. On January 13, 1975, Secretary of the Air Force John McLucas announced the YF-16 as the winner. The technology demonstrator that was never supposed to enter production had just become a program of record. Winning the fly-off didn't mean winning acceptance. Within the Tactical Air Command, the F-16 had a reputation problem that no amount of test data could fix because the people who hated it hadn't bothered reading the test data. They'd read the spec sheet, seen a single-engine fighter with a small radar, and no beyond visual range missile capability, and concluded the Air Force had just bought a toy. The Eagle community was the worst. F-15 pilots had been told, correctly, that they flew the most capable air superiority fighter on the planet. The F-16 threatened that narrative simply by existing. If the cheap fighter could hold its own against a MiG-29 or Su-27, what exactly justified the Eagle's cost? So, the institutional immune response kicked in. F-16 pilots at Nellis and Luke heard lawn dart, so often the nickname became semi-official. Single engine meant you were one turbine failure away from a smoking hole in the Nevada desert. The implication was clear. The F-16 wasn't a real fighter. It was a budget compromise that would get pilots killed. The hostility ran deeper than locker room trash talk. Assignment to an F-16 squadron in the late 1970s was widely perceived as a career disadvantage. The prestige billets went to Eagle drivers. Promotion boards noticed which cockpit you'd sat in. The irony should have been obvious. The Air Force had a recent, painful example of what happens when you let institutional pride override tactical reality. In Vietnam, F-105, Thunder Chief pilots flew into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth with an aircraft designed for nuclear strike, not air combat. They took catastrophic losses, 382 thuds lost in Southeast Asia. The service mourned those pilots. Then it turned around and dismissed a nimble fighter because it didn't look like what a real Air Force aircraft was supposed to look like. General Bill Creech, who took command of Tactical Air Command in 1978, later wrote in a passage quoted by Robert Coram, "The F-16 was the most maneuverable fighter in the world, and half the Air Force didn't want it." He spent the next 6 years fighting that attitude, and mostly won. Between 1979 and 1982, the F-16A fleet experienced 36 engine-related mishaps, including 14 that resulted in total aircraft loss. The critics didn't need to invent problems. The Viper was handing them real ones. The Pratt & Whitney F1 00-PW-2 00 engine was the worst offender. It had been developed for the F-15, where it ran in a twin-engine configuration that gave pilots a second power plant if the first one stalled or flamed out. Shoehorned into the F-16's single-engine airframe, every F-100 malfunction became an immediate emergency. The engine suffered from stagnation stalls, sudden, violent compressor disruptions triggered by rapid throttle movements during hard maneuvering, which happened to be exactly what the F-16 was designed to do. A pilot pulling 9G in a turning fight who slammed the throttle from idle to afterburner could find himself riding 19,000 pounds of dead metal. The Air Force restricted throttle movement rates as an interim fix, which amounted to telling F-16 pilots to fly their agile fighter less aggressively. Boyd would have appreciated the absurdity. The APG-66 radar worked, but worked is doing heavy lifting in that sentence. It could track targets at roughly 40 nautical miles in a clean environment, adequate for a visual range dogfighter, inadequate for anything beyond that. Against ground clutter, the early software struggled badly. F-15 pilots with the APG-63, capable of tracking beyond 80 nautical miles with look-down/shoot-down capability, pointed to the radar gap as proof the F-16 was a fair-weather toy. Structural issues compounded the perception. Fatigue cracks appeared in the vertical tail attachment points of early Block 1 and Block 5 aircraft well ahead of their projected service life. Bulkhead reinforcements had to be retrofitted across the fleet. The horizontal stabilizer pivot also showed unexpected wear patterns under sustained high G loading, the one flight regime the whole airframe had been optimized for. None of these problems were unusual for a new fighter type. The F-15 had experienced its own F-100 engine difficulties, and the F-14 Tomcats TF-30 engines were killing pilots throughout the aircraft's early career. The difference was political. Every F-16 failure fed a narrative that the Fighter Mafia's cheap airplane was exactly that, cheap. 8 F-16. INET's fighters crossed the Jordanian border at 100 feet above the desert floor, so low their jet wash kicked sand into visible trails behind them. It was June 7, 1981, a Sunday afternoon, and the pilots had been told the timing was deliberate. The French technicians working at Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor would be off-site for the weekend. Each aircraft carried 2 unguided Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs under the wings and full internal fuel, a weapons load that pushed the gross weight past 23,000 pounds. Auxiliary fuel tanks hung from the centerline and inboard stations. The F-16A had been in Israeli Air Force service for barely a year. The mission profile was, by any honest assessment, suicidal on paper. The target sat 610 miles from Etzion Air Base in the Sinai, near the F-16A's maximum combat radius under those loadout conditions. 6 F-15As flew top cover, carrying nothing but air-to-air missiles, tasked with handling any Iraqi interceptors. The Vipers were bomb trucks. Nobody in the planning cell pretended otherwise. The lightweight fighter built for dogfighting was about to fly the longest single-engine strike mission in Israeli military history, threading through Jordanian and Saudi airspace without permission, with zero margin for navigational error and not enough fuel to divert if something went wrong. Colonel Ilan Ramon, who would later die aboard Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003, was the youngest pilot in the formation at 27. Ze'ev Raz led the strike package. In an interview published years later in the Israeli Air Force magazine, Raz described the final minutes of the ingress. The formation popped up to altitude for target acquisition, and he could see the reactor dome sitting inside its concrete containment structure on the banks of the Tigris, exactly where the intelligence photos said it would be. The attack lasted roughly 80 seconds. All 8 pilots released their ordnance in successive diving passes from approximately 5,000 feet. 14 of the 16 bombs struck the reactor complex directly. The containment dome collapsed. Iraqi anti-aircraft fire opened up after the first bombs hit, but failed to track the egressing fighters. No F-16 took damage. The entire strike package, F-16S and F-15 escorts, returned to Israeli airspace with fuel gauges brushing empty. The condemnation came from everywhere, almost immediately. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 487 condemning the strike. The Reagan administration temporarily suspended F-16 deliveries to Israel. None of that changed what had just happened operationally. An aircraft dismissed as a clear-weather dogfighter with limited range had just put 14 unguided bombs into a hardened reactor complex at 610 miles from home. 87.5% accuracy, no guided munitions, no second pass. The Viper had just told everyone what it could do. Whether anyone wanted to hear it or not, the Air Force was still 2 years away from figuring that out. Over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley in June 1982, the Israeli Air Force dismantled the Syrian air defense network in what remains the most lopsided air campaign since 1967. Operation Mole Cricket 19 destroyed 29 of Syria's 30 SAM batteries in the opening hours. What followed was a turkey shoot. Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s scrambled to respond and flew straight into a wall of Israeli fighters operating under superior electronic warfare coverage and ground-controlled intercept direction. Over 2 days of sustained air combat, the IAF shot down between 82 and 86 Syrian aircraft. Sources conflict on the exact figure, without losing a single fighter to enemy air action. F-16. INET's pilots claimed roughly 44 of those kills. The aircraft built for dogfighting had finally dogfighted. Boyd's energy maneuverability charts had called it almost to the decimal. Syrian pilots flying Soviet tactics, ground-controlled intercepts with rigid vectoring and minimal pilot initiative, were outmaneuvered repeatedly at close range. The Viper's sustained turn rate and its ability to point the nose faster than anything in the Soviet inventory left Syrian pilots with no workable counter. The kill count kept climbing over the following years. By 1985, Israeli F-16N had accumulated over 50 air-to-air victories with 0 losses in aerial combat. Pakistani F-16 as added to the tally during the Soviet-Afghan War, with PAF pilots downing at least 10 confirmed intruders along the Afghan border between 1986 and 1989, mostly Soviet and Afghan Air Force aircraft that strayed into Pakistani airspace. Squadron leader Khalid Mahmoud alone claimed 3 kills. The F-15 still held the overall air-to-air record, and Eagle partisans were quick to point that out. Fair enough. But the argument had shifted. Nobody credible was calling the F-16 a lawn dart after the Bekaa Valley. The Viper could fight. that was settled. What remained unsettled was whether the Air Force would acknowledge what the Israelis had been proving operationally since 1982. Major General Avihu Ben-Nun, who later became IAF commander, told Jane's Defense Weekly in a 1986 interview that the F-16 gave us a true multi-role capability that changed how we thought about force structure. The Pentagon was taking notes, even if it wasn't saying so publicly. Ground crews at Shaw Air Force Base were bolting lantern pods onto F-16C Block 40s in late 1991, when the full scope of what the Viper was becoming started to crystallize. The low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night system weighed 950 pounds across its two pods, one for navigation, one for targeting, and it turned an aircraft designed to knife fight in daylight into something that could find a single vehicle on a desert road at 2 in the morning and put a laser-guided bomb through its windshield. The Block 40 Night Falcon, as it came to be known, was the pivot point. The block upgrade system was, in retrospect, the F-16's secret weapon, more important than its thrust-to-weight ratio or its fly-by-wire controls. General Dynamics and later Lockheed Martin had designed an airframe with enough structural margin, electrical capacity, and hardpoint flexibility to absorb 3 decades of upgrades that hadn't been imagined when Harry Hilliker's team drew the original lines. Block 15 brought the enlarged horizontal tail and upgraded APG-66 in V-2Y radar. Block 25 introduced the APG-68 and the ability to carry OMRAMs, giving the Viper a beyond visual range kill capability that would have horrified the Fighter Mafia purists. Block 30 and 32 offered the alternative General Electric F110 engine. The great engine war between Pratt & Whitney and GE drove reliability improvements that finally killed the stagnation stall problem. Block 40 added Lantern. Block 50 brought the AGM-88 harm targeting system, turning the Viper into a dedicated SAM killer in the Wild Weasel role, a mission previously owned by the F-4G Phantom, an aircraft that was older than most of its pilots. None of it was cheap. The Block 50 unit price had climbed past $30 million, roughly triple what the Fighter Mafia had envisioned. But the cost per capability ratio kept improving even as the sticker price rose, because what you got for $30 million in 1993 would have required 3 separate aircraft in 1978. Harry Hilliker, in a 1991 paper presented to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, wrote that the F-16 had exceeded every growth projection we made in 1972, and that the airframe's structural and electrical reserves were generous by design. But what the services have done with that margin surprised even us. He wasn't being modest. The original YF-16 had 9 hardpoints and could carry 11,500 pounds of external stores. By Block 50, the F-16 carried 12 hardpoints, could haul over 17,000 pounds, and integrated weapon systems, GPS-guided JDAMs, joint standoff weapons, targeting pods with infrared resolution measured in milliradians that belonged to a different technological century than the one the aircraft was born in. The dogfighter had become a bomb truck, an air superiority fighter, a SEAD platform, a reconnaissance asset, and a forward air control aircraft, sometimes on the same sortie. The Pentagon had spent 20 years trying to decide what the F-16 was for. By the mid-1990s, the aircraft had rendered the question irrelevant. At the Lockheed Martin plant in Greenville, South Carolina, F-16 Block 70s roll off the production line on a schedule that would have seemed absurd to anyone standing in the Fort Worth factory in 1978. As of early 2025, total F-16 production has passed 4,600 airframes, making it the most produced Western fighter jet since the F-86 Sabre. 25 nations currently operate the type. Bahrain, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Taiwan all have active Block 70/72 orders in the pipeline, with deliveries stretching past 2028. The Block 70/72 bears roughly the same resemblance to Harry Hilliker's YF-16 that a modern smartphone bears to a rotary telephone. The APG-83 Scalable Agile Beam Radar an active electronically scanned array derived from the F-35's APG-81, gives the latest Viper sensor fusion capabilities that didn't exist in any fighter on Earth when the prototype first flew. The cockpit runs a center pedestal display, pulling data from the automatic ground collision avoidance system, which has already saved at least 12 pilots from controlled flight into terrain since its introduction. Structural service life on the Block 70 airframe is rated at 12,000 hours, up from 8,000 on earlier C/D models. Unit cost sits around $63 million. An F-35A, depending on which lot number you're quoting, runs between $80 million and $106 million. The math isn't subtle. For nations that need a credible multi-role fighter without the logistics tail and infrastructure demands of fifth-generation stealth, the F-16 remains the obvious answer. Lockheed Martin knows this, which is why they're still building them alongside the aircraft that was supposed to replace them. The F-35 program office would probably prefer everyone stop making that comparison. Too late. In a 2023 report to Congress, the Government Accountability Office noted that F-16 fleet availability rates consistently exceeded those of the F-35A across every measured fiscal year since 2018. The older aircraft keeps showing up for work. Boyd died in 1997. Sprey died in 2023. Hilliker passed in 2001. The Fighter Mafia's original vision, a stripped-down, single-mission dogfighter with no radar and no beyond visual range capability, never actually got built. What got built was better. The compromise they fought against produced an aircraft that took new radars, new weapons, new engines, and new missions for 50 years running, without a fundamental redesign. That 1971 Air Staff study, the one that called the lightweight fighter concept operationally unsuitable for the projected threat environment, ended up in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. It's filed under call number K168.01. The projected threat environment it warned about came and went 4 times over. The F-16 is still on the ramp,